This video is about how the Titanic might have saved your life. Over 100 years ago, Titanic, the largest ship in the world at the time, took to the sea for the very first time, and this ship was supposed to change the world. It was the largest, most luxurious, and the most technologically advanced passenger ship in the world at the time, and it was famously described as unsinkable. But if you know anything about the history of sea travel, then you know that the Titanic sank on its very first journey. Over 1,000 people died when it sank, causing incredible pain to their families, but also causing grief within the sea travel industry as well. Because the men and women in this industry had to question everything they knew. They had to answer the question of how this ship, which was an engineering marvel and was supposed to change sea travel forever, sank on its very first journey. But it also had to answer an even more important question: how they could make sure that this never happened again. In the unlikely event that you have no idea what the Titanic was, this is a super quick history lesson. Titanic was built over the course of 3 years with one clear goal: to be the largest ship in the world. It had a capacity of up to 3,500 passengers and had 16 watertight compartments, which was why everyone thought the ship was unsinkable. On its highly publicized and hugely anticipated first ever trip from Southampton in the UK to New York in the US, it struck an iceberg and sank to the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean within 2 hours and 40 minutes. Immediately after the sinking of the Titanic, governments in the US and the UK wanted to figure out what had caused the sinking. Now, it seemed obvious that hitting an iceberg in the ocean caused the ship to sink, but it was also important to find out other factors that may have resulted in that outcome. After several weeks, the investigation in both countries came to similar conclusions about the causes of the sinking, but more importantly, the investigations led to some major changes in maritime law to ensure that an accident as tragic as the Titanic never happened again. Nearly 3 hours passed between the time Titanic struck an iceberg and sank into the Atlantic. And in those 3 hours, a majority of the passengers on the ship could have been saved by moving into lifeboats. But there was just one problem. There weren't enough lifeboats on the Titanic. There were over 2,000 people on board, but there were only 20 lifeboats on the ship. Why? Well, first, remember that the ship was thought of as unsinkable. So why would you need lifeboats on a ship that couldn't sink? But more importantly, the lifeboat shortage on the Titanic was also due to the fact that, crazy as it might sound, the Titanic was not legally required to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. And that was the law at the time. You see, back in 1912, the number of lifeboats required on a ship was determined by the ship's gross tonnage or weight, rather than the number of passengers it carried. And so according to the UK's Board of Trade, British ships weighing greater than 10,000 tons were only required to carry a minimum of 16 lifeboats. Titanic had a gross tonnage of over 46,000 tons. It turns out that the 20 lifeboats on the Titanic was actually 4 more than legally required. So however bad it looked at the time that there weren't enough lifeboats on this ship, the Titanic was actually complying with existing law for lifeboat requirements at the time. But of course, after the sinking of the Titanic, maritime laws with regard to lifeboat requirements had to be changed. Rather than benchmark the number of lifeboats by a ship's weight, it became a legal requirement that ships carry enough lifeboats to evacuate everyone on board if needed. And if anyone thought this was an overreaction, then they were proven wrong just 4 years later, in 1916, when another ship called the HMHS Britannic sank. Now, the Britannic sank within 55 minutes, nearly 2 hours faster than the Titanic did, and the ship carried 1,066 people. But because it had 35 lifeboats compared to the Titanic's 20, 97% of the people on board of the Britannic ended up being saved. The most obvious reason for the Titanic sinking was the fact that it hit an iceberg, a huge iceberg. The crew of the Titanic was tracking icebergs by having 2 lookouts in the crow's nest of the ship looking out for icebergs. And even worse, neither of the 2 lookouts had binoculars, which meant they could only look for icebergs as far as their eyes could see. Now, they saw and reported the iceberg that sank the Titanic too late for the ship to change direction. So how do you ensure that never happens again? By creating a more sophisticated system to properly look out for icebergs and provide ships with early warnings on the specific locations of those icebergs. And that system is called the International Ice Patrol. That's an organization that was established in 1914 in response to the sinking of the Titanic. The primary function of the International Ice Patrol is to track and monitor the icebergs in the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans and provide iceberg warnings to ships traveling in those areas. That's it. The entire job is to track and report icebergs. The International Ice Patrol is operated by the US Coast Guard, but it is funded by lots of countries that all have an interest in ensuring that transatlantic travel and trade remains as safe as possible. According to reports, the International Ice Patrol tracks and reports about 1,000 icebergs every year, providing ships with specific locations of those icebergs and advanced safety warnings. And the evidence suggests that that system is working. And that evidence is one simple statistic. There have been no losses of lives due to iceberg collisions in the areas under surveillance of the International Ice Patrol since it came into existence. After Titanic hit the iceberg, Jack Phillips, the chief telegraphist on the ship, immediately got on the radio to send distress signals across radio waves, hoping to get in touch with nearby ships or anyone, in fact, and force a rescue operation. But back in 1912, radio waves were not regulated, which meant the airwaves were often clogged by noise from amateur radio operators and others. Now, at the time of the Titanic's sinking, a ship called the SS Californian was only 10 miles away from the Titanic and could have potentially received those distress signals sent from the Titanic and, of course, led a rescue mission. But the radio operator on the SS Californian had reportedly closed for the day and gone to bed, so the Californian never got the Titanic's distress calls. After the sinking of the Titanic, new laws came into effect and changed how radios were used at sea in three key ways. First, the US created the Radio Act of 1912, which required radio operators to be licensed. This had a cyclical effect. First, it meant there were fewer people transmitting on the airwaves, which also meant the airwaves would not be as clogged up as they used to be, which then ensured that important radio messages had a better chance of getting through. The second change was that all ships were required to have a wireless radio operator on active duty at all times, which meant they had to work in shifts and avoid a situation where an operator went to bed and left the radio unattended. And finally, distress signals were given increased priority on radio waves. 2 decades after the sinking of the Titanic, the US Communications Act of 1934 created a separate frequency just for distress signals, again, to ensure that distress signals got the highest priority on the radio waves. One of mankind's most repeated mantras is the need to learn from the past and make the future better. And it's clear that humans learned from the sinking of the Titanic. Today, a lot of the changes that were made right after the sinking are still in place and continue to ensure the safety of ships carrying thousands of people at sea every year. When the Titanic was built, everyone thought it would change sea travel, and it did just that, just not in the way that most people had imagined. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, then check out this next video about a woman who survived 3 tragic sea accidents, including the sinking of the Titanic, all within 5 short years.